In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint the brand new Abhorrent Gore Warden from the Flesh Eater Court's army. A huge thank you to Games Workshop who sent me this out for free in order for me to review and create content for you. So without any further ado, let's get painting. This sculpt is fantastic and I really love how it menacingly leans forward. So the first thing I've done is prime the model with some Death Guard green, and then I've sprayed it with White Bone, or you can use Wraithbone spray as well, over the majority of the model, just leaving a little bit of that darker colour underneath. Now, unusually, I'm actually going to paint the base of this model first. So I'm going to take some Karak Stone, I'm going to paint all of the stonework in this colour. And that's because the techniques I'm going to use on the Gore Warden himself is going to be mainly washes. So we don't want to be dry brushing this after we've finished the Gore Warden. Once that Karak Stone is completely dry, we'll then take some Space Wolves Grey contrast paint. Now I'm going to paint this all over the bits that I've painted in Karak Stone. So take your time with this and don't let it pool in any recesses. It's really important that you don't have it on too thickly, as that'll make the next steps a little bit more difficult. It's really important the Space Wolves Grey is completely dry for this next step. I'm then going to take some Grey Seer. I'm going to heavily dry brush this all over the rock. Now the reason I'm heavily dry brushing this is because it's going to take up the majority of the surface area, so it'll start to turn the colour of the rock from that grey-blue colour to a much more neutral lighter grey, but still having the warmth in the depth and the shadows. Finally, we'll take a little bit of white and just give this a light dry brush over that rock, and that's just going to catch on all the sharpest edges just to help it stand out really nicely. So I mentioned we're going to use a wash to get this started, and the wash I'm going to use is Kroak Green, which is a very nice pale green. Now, I'm not thinning this down at all. I'm just painting it all over the flesh of the Gore Warden, and I'm painting it exclusively on the flesh and also the spines that go up the wings, because we'll start to build up those colours a little bit shortly as well. So take your time with this and try not to spill it on any of those areas where you don't want it. It's not a huge issue if you do. We just want to make sure we've got a nice even coverage and keep that moving as well, because we don't want it to pool too deeply in any recesses. When that's completely dry, we're then going to take another wash, Poxwalker, and we're going to use this to start to darken some of the recesses, in particular around the hands and the feet. Now we want to work it into the gaps just to darken them down a little bit, and then we just want to add a little bit across the fleshy area as well. And that's really going to help get a nice transition from a nice bright light colour to just slightly darker on the hands and the feet. We're also going to use this colour to start blending the spines on the wings. To blend with this is fairly easy and straightforward. The first thing we need to do is just paint the majority of the area where the blend is going to take place. Once we've painted, it's important we move quite quickly. So as it's still wet, clean your brush off, wipe it onto some kitchen paper or some tissue so it's damp but not wet, and then just feather along the edge into that underlying Kroak Green. Now take your time, it's fairly easy to get this done. If you do make any mistakes, you can just paint over it and start again. But it's just key to make sure that you get them to move into each other. If you need to add a little bit more Kroak Green into the wet Poxwalker, then you can do, but just be cautious. That's just going to make it fairly uncontrollable on the model. So, if you're not sure how to do this, my advice to you is to prime up a little bit of sprue and practice it on there, so you can just practice moving it back and forth and getting those blends. Once that's completely dry and you've painted the rest of the spines of the Poxwalker, we're then going to add a second coat of Poxwalker over exactly the same area, but we're going to start it about halfway back from where that blend was to the first spine. And this is going to just feather across to just ease that transition and get a nice change from the lighter green colour to the darker green colour as we look to add darker colours on top of this again. The first dark colour we're going to use is Kroxigor Scales, which is a contrast paint. And again, I'm not thinning this down, but I'm doing it in exactly the same way I did the blend earlier on. So I'm going to paint all of the spines first, and then once we get to that bit where the Poxwalker darkens into the Kroxigor Scales, we're going to paint it into the area, we're going to clean our brush off, we're going to wipe it so that it's damp, not wet, and we're just going to feather the edge of that Kroxigor Scales into the Poxwalker. Now, it's really important that you work fast here again, because that edge of Kroxigor Scales will start to dry fairly quickly, and you don't want to leave a little bit of a tide mark. So again, if you're not sure how to do this, you don't want to do it on your model to start with, again, go back to that little bit of practice sprue that you might have and just try it and experiment with different things to see what works best for you. The final blend we're going to do on those spines is with Black Templar, again with a contrast paint. And we're also going to paint all of the sharp claws with this, and also the claws coming out of the spines as well. So again, the technique is exactly the same as what we've done before. So we're going to paint that last bit of spine in the Black Templar. We're going to clean our brush off. We're going to make sure that it's not wet, it's just damp. We're going to feather the edge into the Kroxigor scale. Now again, you can add a little bit of Kroxigor scale back in to move it back and forth if you want. But again, just remember, it is a little bit more uncontrollable when you do it that way because you've got a lot of liquid in a very small space. Like I said, we're also going to paint all of the claws, such as on the hands and the feet, as well as those spines. Whilst we're waiting for some of this paint to dry, I really want to tell you a little bit about my Patreon. So now that I've started to get kits from Games Workshop, my plan is to put on their box reviews. So the first box review for Flesh Eater Coats is up and live now. You can go and watch it. You don't have to sign up to my Patreon. It's free for everyone. Just check the link in the description and you can see a 20-minute review where I talk about the contents of the box, the army book, as well as some of the challenges I foresee with models on the sprue, and also a little bit of a review then once I've built some to let you know how they went. And like I said, that's free for everyone right now. So to my eye, this is looking okay, but I want to get that wing membrane based, and we'll probably do the wing membrane next actually, just to start to get a little bit of context around the model and start to see how it's coming together. So the colour I'm going to use is Khorne Red, and I'm going to paint this over all of the wing membranes. Now, this is a fairly easy step. Just take your time because it's so easy to make a mistake, accidentally paint over something you've already finished. And if you do that, it's going to be a lot more difficult to fix because of all the blending that you've already done. Now, with the Khorne Red, it's a lovely colour. I really like it, but it is quite difficult to get a really good coverage in one coat with it. So I am going to have to do 2 coats. And that's fine. It's just a case of getting it down there, being careful and getting a nice, thick, all-over coverage. We'll start to build some texture on those wings next. So the first thing we're going to do is take some Nuln Oil. Now I'm going to paint this like a layer paint, not like a wash. And I'm going to work it all over the Khorne Red on those wings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep spreading it out so it doesn't settle too much in any recesses. And essentially it's just going to darken down that Khorne Red. Now, potentially you could mix some Khorne Red in with black to do it in one layer, but I decided to do it this way because I'm going to build up quite a little bit of transition and some mottling on here, which is going to really build some texture. To build that texture, I'm going to roughly stipple some Nuln Oil into those recesses. Now, you can see here, these are fairly big dollops of Nuln Oil that are going onto the wings, but I'm focusing them towards the spines and the arms and leaving the lighter areas towards the edges of the wings, just building up that texture on the inside. Like I said, this is fairly rough stabbing motion, stippling on some of this Nuln Oil and just letting it settle and letting it dry. Once it has completely dried, I'm going to go back in with a little bit more Nuln Oil and I'm going to stipple specifically around those areas where you've got the most shadow and along the areas where the spines start to intersect and along the arm of the wing as well. So very much on the inside. That doesn't mean I'm only going to do the inside. I'm going to do both sides of the wing membrane, but this is just going to give it a much darker effect in towards the centre. To start highlighting the wings, I'm going to go back to Khorne Red and I'm going to do 2 things. Firstly, I'm going to stipple this along those areas where I feel that the Nuln Oil is a little bit too blotchy, a little bit too heavy, or is a little bit too far away from where I want it. And that'll start to blend it back into the rest of the wings. The other thing I'm doing is looking for really sharp creases. And there are a few along the wings, not a huge amount. And this is why you've got to build up your own texture to an extent, and I'm just going to highlight them like a normal edge highlight. With that done, it's time to start highlighting in earnest. Now the first colour I'm going to use is Wazdakka Red, which is a fairly desaturated red, and I'm going to go back to that tried and tested stippling motion. Now I'm going to stipple this aiming towards the edge of the wings. The final highlight on the wings, and this is going to be used a lot more sparingly than any of the other colours, is with Squig Orange, which is a desaturated orangey red. And again, I'm going to stipple this along the far edges of the wings, and I'm also going to catch those specifically sharp folds and also the edge creases with the side of the brush as well. And this will just help those wings to stand out a little bit more. One thing I did while I had the Wazdakka Red out was to paint in some veins along the wings. Now, this is really easy. You just need to make sure you've got a very good tip on your brush and not much paint. And I'm just painting some thin, wavy lines out from the center of the wings. And again, in terms of where I'm stopping, it's completely random across the wings, and each one's different. And this just adds to the realism, really builds that texture. So with that, we'll move on to the leather next. There's a little bit around his waist, and the colour I'm going to base this with is Rhinox Hide, which is a nice dark reddy brown colour. So it's really important to take your time doing this, because it's going to be quite difficult to fix any mistakes you make if you paint over bits of the flesh. So I'm working my way around. There are some metal bits on here as well, but I'm not worrying too much if I get Rhinox Hide on them. In fact, that'll make the next stages easier if you don't worry about that at all. Once that's dry, we'll highlight it all up with some Doom Bull Brown, which is a very nice reddy brown. We're focusing on things like the edges here. Again, there's not much to do because there's quite a lot of metal around the belt. It's quite an awkward location as well. So don't force yourself to do it if you don't feel comfortable. As long as you've got that base coat down, it will look fine. The final highlight I'm doing is with a little bit of Scrag Brown, which is a nice bright orangey brown. And I'm going to use this fairly sparingly, and this is very specifically on just the sharpest edges of the model. So I'm not going too wild with this, just taking the tip of my brush and pulling it along whatever edge I can find. We'll base all of the metallics next, and regardless of what colour the metal will end up, I'm going to base it with Leadbelcher. Everything's going to be silver to start with. So this is nice and easy. You don't have to worry about having loads of different colours and shades. We're going to use contrast paints to change the colour on some of them. So just take your time around those areas you've already finished and use the Leadbelcher just to base them really nicely. When that's dry, we're going to take some Nuln Oil and we're going to shade all of the silver parts. So this is, again, is a fairly easy, straightforward step. You just need to take your time, particularly around those bits you've already finished and on the skin. I'm thinking specifically the bracelet and any keys you've got on the legs. Finally, we will highlight all of that silver using some chrome from Vallejo Model Air. So we can afford to use this fairly sparingly. If you haven't got this paint, you can use something like Stormhost Silver. It's absolutely fine. And we're just going to use the shape of the brush to pull it along the model and make sure it just catches those most raised edges that are going to get the most light. And that's going to be a nice and simple highlight. Again, you don't need to go too overboard with this. Now, I mentioned we were going to use some contrast paints to alter the colour of some of these keys and some of the embellishments on the belt. And the first one is going to be Aggaros Dunes. This is a nice, easy thing to do. You're just going to paint it over the metallics, and this will give you kind of like a goldy, brassy colour, which is really nice and really easy. Then if you want something a little bit more yellowy gold, you can use something like Nazdreg Yellow. Now this Nazdreg Yellow, again, just painting it over the metallic, and you're going to get a really, really nice effect. So you'll have a bright gold, a dark brass, and some silver. So that's all your three metallic colours done. So we'll paint the flesh next. Now, we have some rather unfortunate chaps. One is just a head, and the other one is just a torso and a head strapped to the base. So we're going to paint that. But also, that kind of rag and cloth that the guy's wearing, the Aberrant Gore Warden, I wasn't really sure what colour to paint. I thought, why not make it out of flayed flesh? So we're going to base all of these using Cadian Fleshtone, just working our way around, trying to get a nice even coverage all over. We're not going to shade it just yet. We're just going to highlight it up to a nice bright pallid colour. So then we're going to take some Kislev Flesh and paint this over the Cadian Flesh, focusing on the raised parts of the fold, leaving that Cadian Fleshtone in the recesses. So this is a fairly easy and straightforward step. Don't forget, obviously, you've got the flesh of the torso and the head on the base, and also the cloak that the Gore Warden's wearing. So just take your time. If you need to put a second coat on to really build the colour up, that's okay as well. The final highlight is going to be with Flayed One Flesh. Now, this is a bit of a step up in terms of value, and it's much lighter and brighter than the other colours we've used, but that's fine. And we're going to focus this just on the sharpest edges and sharpest folds of the flesh, and also the parts. So if I'm looking at the torso, for example, the bits that are going to catch the most light. And use it fairly sparingly. You can always add a little bit more on later if you need to, but generally we're just looking to catch those sharp folds. So I want to add a little bit of colour into that flesh, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Berserker Bloodshade, which is kind of like a reddy brown wash. And what I'm looking to do with this is make sure I haven't got too much on my brush, and I'm looking to just stipple it into some of the recesses and stipple it along some of the edges of this flesh that are going to have been torn and cut, because I think that's where the damaged skin needs to be. Similarly, for the torso, it's fairly obvious where we need to put the Berserker Bloodshade into all of the wounds, the scratches, the marks, and also where his limbs have been cut off. We want to put it in there a little bit more heavily as well. So again, use it sparingly. You can always go back and add more. The last thing I want to do to the flesh is just make it look a little bit more rotten, as though it's kind of going off a little bit. So to do that, we're going back to Kroak Green. Again, very little on your brush, and we're just going to stipple this in random patches over the flesh, and that'll just start to tint the hue a little bit of the flesh to like a greeny colour, which kind of gives the impression that it's going off. I'm going to take a little bit of Volupous Pink now to paint the inside of the mouth and also around the teeth, so we kind of get the impression of some gums. I'm also going to use to paint this on the inside of the ears, just to give a little bit of warmth to those areas. Once that's dry, I'm going to take some Zandri Dust to base all of the bone. So this model, obviously there are the teeth, there's the skull hanging down by the side, but there's also that, I'm going to call it a ruff, an Elizabethan ruff, that looks like it's made out of rib bones around the neck of the Gore Warden. So we're going to paint those with the Zandri Dust as well. To add a little bit of definition to everything, we're going to take some Aggaros Earthshade and wash this over all of the bone areas. Now, a key thing with this is to not put it on too heavily. We don't want to go too crazy with it. We just want it to give some definition and a little bit of shade, so take your time. When that's dry, we'll start to highlight the bone areas back up. And the first colour we're going to use is Zandri Dust. We're going to leave that Aggaros Earthshade in the recesses, and this is going to start a little bit of a transition, which should be fairly straightforward to do. Next up, it's Ushabti Bone. And with the Ushabti Bone, we're going to look to catch the edges of all of the bone. So just make sure you haven't got too much on your brush and just pull it along the edges of the model, and this will start to give a nice crisp highlight. Now, in some areas, you may go a little bit awry and you might put it on a bit too thickly. That's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it too much. Just start to build up that highlight and focus it along those edges, the frontermost edge of those rib bones along the ruff around the neck. As a final highlight there, and on the teeth, we're going to take a mix of 50-50 Ushabti Bone and white. Now, you can use whatever white paint you want. I just wanted something that was brighter than Screaming Skull, because I think this next step up needs to be a bit more. So again, we're going to focus along those sharp edges, making sure we haven't got too much on our brush, and also just be very careful painting the teeth to give them a nice sharp effect. To paint the rope around the base, I was umming and ahhing what to use for this, but I'm just going to use some Aggaros Dunes because we've already used it once just to save a paint colour. So just paint the rope using Aggaros Dunes, being very careful not to spill it over the rock, and you'll see as it dries, this will give you a really nice rope colour that you don't have to worry about going in and highlighting. It's shaded, highlighted, based, everything in the one step. It does exactly what it's meant to do as a contrast paint. We then need to go back in and paint the little tufts of hair that the Gore Warden's got. So I'm just going to use Black Templar for this. And this is mainly where the wing spines come off, but he has got some hair on his head as well. So just take your time and work your way around, being very careful, particularly around the brighter areas. We'll highlight the claws next, and the first colour I'm going to use for this is Mechanicus Standard Grey. And all I'm doing is making sure that I've got a little bit on my brush and I'm pulling it along the shape of the model to get a nice crisp highlight. It's fairly easy and straightforward this, but the effect is quite nice. It does make it look as though those claws are quite sharp. We'll follow that up with some Administratum Grey, which is a much brighter grey. Again, focusing this just towards the tip to make them look really sharp. Now, if you want to, you can add a dot of white right on the ends, but I'm okay just with the Administratum Grey. As ever, painting eyes on camera is difficult for me, but I'm going to give it a go. So we just need to take some Flashgitz Yellow, which is a fairly bright yellow, and just got to paint the eyeball with this colour. It's nice and easy and straightforward. You don't have to be too concerned about coverage, because it should cover these small areas quite nicely. The final thing to do is to give the flesh a bit of a highlight. We're focusing specifically on the shoulders, the head, and the kind of the arms here, a little bit on the thighs as well. So what I've done is taken some white paint. Again, use whatever white you feel comfortable with. And I've put in 2 drops of Kroak Green. So 1 drop of paint, 2 drops of Kroak Green. Mix them up and you get a really light, really thin white highlight paint. And I'm just going to focus this on the areas that really need it. And you'll start to see that these are just lightening up ever so slightly. You may need to put 2 coats on, but this gives you a really, really nice effect, a nice subtle highlight. and doesn't go too far from that colour that you've built up with just the Kroak Green. In fact, it looks really nice when you consider the feet and the hands are slightly darker, and they all move to this lighter area in the middle, focusing on the head. So there we go, this Aberrant Gore Warden is done. I'm really happy with how he's turned out, and I really love the new Flesh Eater Coats box. Like I said, if you want to go check out my Patreon, there is a free to anyone. You don't have to sign up. You can watch a review of the box where I go through the sprues. I talk about what they can be like to build, and also show you about some of the challenges I came across building some of the models. So thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and a comment down below, and I will see you next time.